Another extra special guest this week. Last week, we had Matt Metcalf, the director of the sports book at Circa, and that was met with a great response. And that was a sports bettor that went into being a sports book operator. And now we're going to go the opposite way. Very, very happy to welcome Todd Fuhrman to this broadcast. He started off in Chicago, came to Las Vegas, some schooling in between, some Australia in between, went to Caesars, and he left Caesars to go the other direction that Matt did. So I'm going to hand it off to Ron. Ron, what's your first question on this?
Well, basically, since you came from that side of the counter, how did that time spent on that side of the counter benefit you when you're going back into the betting field?
Yeah, honestly, guys, hey, first and foremost, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to tell a bit of my story, and hopefully we can entertain a lot of the audience for the better part of this interview. But Ron, my path to getting into this industry was a little bit different than a lot of folks. I know you guys have spoken to some of the rainmakers in the space through these various interviews and such. But I came out to Vegas knowing I wanted to work in sports, but just wasn't sure how to be able to carve out that pathway. So I started in casino finance. I was a number cruncher, a paper pusher, whatever terminology you want to use, for being in the office from about 8 in the morning until 8 at night, trying to figure out how to make these massive casinos more money. And it took me a couple of years before I got my chance behind the counter. Chuck Esposito was the one that took me under his wing, taught me an awful lot about the business in terms of how to book to faces, handle things over on that side of the counter. And gradually, as time would have it, Caesars gave me a bigger platform to talk about the industry, to go out publicly and try and find ways to engage with an audience. But I think the time spent behind the counter allows you to think like a bookmaker, and it forces your hand a little bit as a sports bettor, since there's a lot more similarities with a very fine line, kind of splitting us apart as far as the community is concerned. So if you can put yourself in the shoes of a bookmaker, it allows you to identify a little bit of opportunities. You can understand why some of the numbers and markets are set the way they are. And, we always talk about to catch a thief, you have to think like one. I think a lot of the same thing can apply to starting out as an odds maker, migrating into bookmaking, and then obviously now working on this side of the counter, trying to figure out how to extract the most value from some of those soft numbers.
I assume that you also had some bookmaker, and some betting experience before you started out there. And I assume that also changed after your experience behind the counter.
Yeah, it did. And it probably started out at a younger age than I should openly admit. It may not be something my parents are extremely proud of, but my dad gets full credit for getting me into this lifestyle, or this line of work, I should say. I mean, I started picking games with him in the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune, driving to hockey practice on those frigid Chicago mornings at about 5 a.m. We would go back and forth game by game. He decided at some point he wanted to be the house to teach me a valuable lesson. And I think that's what laid the foundation for my fascination, not just with watching sports, but trying to figure out exactly where the numbers started, how the numbers were going to move, and what they told you about individual teams. And probably much like you guys, I got tangled up with bookies in 7th, 8th grade, betting $5 and $10 a game, trying to use my study hall period to flip through a lot of the box scores and some of the stats, not quite as prolific as what they are now. But that's where, I got my passion for the industry, and was relatively fortunate that my folks supported my pursuit along the way. And it wasn't taking that path to Wall Street like I thought I was going to when I started my undergrad education. It was trying to figure out how I could make this a career, not knowing how media would kind of give me that lifeline and a bigger voice than I ever anticipated.
So what was the thinking and process of going from Caesars back out into the real world? Did you have a media gig already lined up? What did you have kind of in your options list there?
So honestly, it was frustration more than anything else. I realized my career wasn't going anywhere at Caesars. They had a very rigid hierarchy. A gentleman that was atop the food chain, Howard Greenbaum, didn't exactly see the sports betting space the way I did, where you should be immersed in it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You should know your customers. You should have a little bit of opinion that you're putting into the numbers, instead of taking a risk-averse approach that a lot of the folks at Caesars did. And while I had some great mentors there, Chuck being one, Mark Titino, and Cindy Gauntz as well, I realized I wasn't going to learn enough about the space staying within that Caesars family. So if I was going to advance, I had to kind of spread my wings. And it was at that point I started poking around, trying to figure out what was going to be the best avenue. And Dom Best Sports, a company that we know all too well, actually came to me with a consulting opportunity. They were looking to try and do some white label video for a lot of offshore books back in the day. And I said, hey, I don't have a ton of on-camera experience. I can learn, and hopefully I can help you guys begin to build out that business, the business to consumer product line. Took a 6-month consulting gig there and figured, you know what, if I don't roll the dice now, I'm going to end up looking back at my time at Caesars. I'm not going to learn a damn thing. And it was honestly the best decision I ever made, and a pretty fortuitous bounce all rolled into one.
You know, I forgot to mention it on the open. In this whole gambling space, you have to be the one good guy. Like, you'd be the superhero. It's like there's nothing tainted about you, and just clean living type of guy. And I just wanted to make that comment. I want to bring up what I consider, everybody asks me, what podcasts do I listen to? And I tell all of them, listen, I listen to them all. And I do pretty much listen to them all. I would think that more people, this has got to be one of the most popular podcasts in the gambling community, called the Bet the Board podcast. And I listened to the NFL yesterday, and it was just very, very well done. I don't necessarily agree with much of the result, the sides and stuff, but I would much prefer to hear Payne come on. And I want you to tell us about Payne, because he seems like an enigma. He finally made video last year for the first time. And like, whatever you thought he looked like, based on his voice, didn't resemble. So share a little bit about the Bet the Board content that you're producing, and tell us a little bit about Payne and what he does and how he gets all that valuable information, because I don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the video component. It was kind of our first step into doing a PTI style discussion with a video element wrapped in there. And let me tell you, Chris and Ron, it took a lot of poking and prodding to try and get Payne on camera. And the running joke around here, as my fiance knows Payne pretty well, given all of our business dealings over the last handful of years, she jokes all the time that his voice should be someone that gets considered for the call map, because it has that therapeutic approach and very melodic way to try and go about things. I'm not sure if he takes that as a compliment necessarily, but when you look at the relationship that we've built in the space, we launched Bet the Board back in 2014. So it really feels like an eternity, long before there was a massive proliferation of some of the sports betting podcasts that were out there. And I actually happened to meet Payne through social media. He was doing a radio show in Philly while I was still behind the counter at Caesars, and they were looking for a voice to kind of come on, share the bookmaker perspective. And his credit, he kind of put my feet to the fire. I mean, there were no softballs there when I would do some of the weekly hits. I'm not sure the Caesars PR team was thrilled about the information that I would reveal on those particular interviews, but it got us to talking. We built our relationship. And, when we launched the podcast, I mean, it was the truest sense of a rudimentary tech program. It basically sounded like we had 2 tin cans. We used a program called GoToMeeting to put together that Payne's dad actually edited. And if we go back and listen to some of the analysis we offered up there, it is a far cry in terms of how this product has evolved. We were doing 1 show a week back then. We gradually got into 2 shows a week for the NFL, since that's Payne's true passion, branched out into college football. And it wasn't until, honestly, a few weeks ago that we committed to doing another weekly show, one that Payne's not a part of, but that's still under the Bet the Board umbrella with NASCAR. As NASCAR got on board, they decided that they wanted to partner up with us to break down some of those analytics. But when you're talking about the podcast, I mean, I use a real cheesy cliche to kind of describe it. And I look at Bet the Board almost like a Whole Foods, where we try and do things in a variety of ways. And I can go backwards to forwards, where we offer up the best bet. It's for the folks that walk in, they want a pre-prepared meal. They trust the quality of the ingredients and the products that are going in there, and they can walk away gleaning some of the value from that. But for a lot of the folks out there who enjoy the process, much like you do, Chris, I mean, we try and provide, compelling cases to be made for Team A, Team B, the over and under in individual games, and try and deep dive a lot more of the stats and analytics that go into than just reading the box score and regurgitating some of that information or trends. So I think there's a lot of people who come in and go, you know what, we don't necessarily care about the best bet that these guys offer up, But at the same time, we want to see the thought process and understand, all right, I get where they're coming from here. I completely disagree. And I think a lot of the back and forth that Payne and I love so much through social media is there are so many different ways to skin a cat in this business. If every professional bettor, everybody that you respected all ended up on the same side of every NFL game, there would be no liquidity in the market and we all be out of business before we ever started.
I usually go into your podcast. I pretty much know who I'm betting already, but I still find the value, and I suggest it to anybody. There's a lot of value in just hearing things out. Don't let them convince you into any games. Make up your own minds. Ron's got a quick question, but I want to ask you, since you brought it up, NASCAR is, a focus of yours now. I'm aware of, it's constantly changing. And this is an example of if you're a bettor and you have a process, this is a sport that keeps changing the rules and changing the dynamics. And I'm not even sure. It would seem really popular a couple of years ago, and it seems to be kind of winding down a little bit. I don't know whether you feel the same way, but what has changed? What have you had to adapt? And is there value in betting this NASCAR?
Yeah, it's definitely a much different market than it was years ago. There is no doubt about it. You see that with some of the limits that are offered and how little movement you actually can see in the betting markets before you get the extra data points from practice leading up to Sunday pre-race, where most folks, like we do, will bet some of the head-to-head matchups that are out there. And to your point, all of us that watch the NFL week in, week out, we bitch and moan about the rule changes, roughing the passer. What does it look like? What's a catch and what isn't a catch? If you're betting NASCAR, that doesn't change season to season. That changes week to week from the different aero packages that are out there, the different tire compounds, and a lot of those other elements. But as a result, I also think it creates a little bit of inefficiency. The problem being is that if you're trying to move larger sums, it's not nearly as accommodating as if you're betting big time college football or the NFL on a week in, week out basis. So obviously as a bettor, you have to get more creative. You have to disguise some of your betting habits. You have to figure out, where you can place your first couple of bets that doesn't disrupt the entire market. So it's the one sport that I bet week in, week out that takes a lot more cat and mouse, even than football. And I would say even more so than college basketball. And of course, unless you're betting, college basketball totals on the overnight. That's a completely different animal that's not even worth comparing to anything else that's out there.
So that segues to me. And first of all, 7th, 8th, and 9th grades resonates perfectly for me. For me, it was boys' glee. And you were either a bettor or a bookie in that class because none of us could sing. I guarantee you that. So, and then then we progressed to the bookies and the Cadillacs and back of the liquor stores. And now we're to this 24/7 business. And you talked about NASCAR, you talked about changing over, you talked about all the podcasts. Are there enough hours in the day for you? What's a typical, do you know what you're doing every Monday during the football season, every Tuesday, every hour? What's a routine like for you?
Yep, I'll get to the schedule in a second, Ron, but it's funny that you bring all of that up because it reminds me of the first time when I actually got my driver's license that my dad let me handle pays and collects with one of our guys. So it wasn't the back of a liquor store then. It was the parking lot of a Jewish deli. I would get there. I didn't know exactly what the guy looked like. So he goes, yeah, I have a black car. It's in the back. Here's my license plate. I get in there. And let me tell you, that car stunk to high heaven of weed. That didn't bother me for a second. There were Dom Best books scattered all over the front and back seat. And there were envelopes scattered throughout the course of the car. So I got back and, talked to my dad about it. I go, you could have at least warned me what the hell I was getting into. He kind of smirked and went, you know what? It's important for you to get the street education now so you know what you're getting yourself into going forward. So, Chris, that kind of where I got a little bit of dirt under my fingernails, but I did try and distance myself from at least some of that to try and present a little bit more favorable visage in the grand scheme of it. But schedule-wise, I think much like you guys, if you're not structured in this business, and you're not planning for success, you're planning to fail. You have to know what you're going to be doing almost every hour of every day, especially during football season from sunrise to sunset. So you can balance college football, the NFL, the ability to watch games, the ability to, make sure you're following all those beat writers on Twitter, that you're reading recaps. And in my case, going back and, watching some of the NFL games that I may have missed. So I actually have a schedule that I put together in Excel that more or less chronicles my day from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m.
Wow.
And honestly, guys, It doesn't include bathroom breaks. It's not quite that granular, but I try and figure out exactly when I'm going to take time for meals, when I'm going to take time for breaks, where I need to flip gears from certain sports. Because the last thing you want is to start doing some analysis at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. You find yourself 6.5, 7 hours later, you've gotten through one game. You're going to end up pulling all-nighters to try and get yourself in a position for that content calendar. When we put out our NFL podcast on Monday, that's a recap of the weekend, Wednesday for college football, Thursday for the NFL preview. That's probably our most listened to show. And now with the incorporation of NASCAR as well, I got to try and find time to make sure I do my race recaps and at least have my preliminary numbers for that show on Wednesday nights.
You know, you kind of touch on things. I think that habits are absolutely crucial, and habits and mental well-being are the two most talked about things in the gambling space, in my opinion, because I think they go hand in hand. Do you think when you see all these new people entering the betting space, do you think that gambling Twitter and peer pressure and outside influences puts too much pressure on the new bettor? Hey, you got to get a model. You got to research this. You got to watch this video. You got to do these pods. You got to do this, and you can't buy points, and you can't do this. And it's like, Calgon, take me away. I mean, do you see, where do you see this stuff going? Is that just a small niche of people? Or is there a lot of peer pressure out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think gambling Twitter, sometimes doesn't give us the most accurate reflection of what actually goes on in the space. And for better or worse, there are some bad practices that get reiterated, regurgitated, that people are likely to mirror. There are also some good things that you're going to learn there that you're not necessarily going to learn for a bettor coming into a new jurisdiction who's talking to his or her buddies, trying to figure out exactly what it takes. My biggest fear with what's going on now with the proliferation of sports betting content is there are so many misconceptions that just get perpetuated over and over again. The idea that anybody can lay 11 to 10 and is somehow going to put together a season where they're consistently hitting 65 to 70%. Chris's NFL notwithstanding, I know that smirk on his face that he's getting to right there, but just trying to make sure that you put a realistic baseline in there, because I think if you set yourself up for failure, there's no reason that you're going to continue to stay in the game. And let's not sugarcoat it. And this won't be popular opinion for most of the people that are watching or the people that we talk to. 99% of people that are out there betting sports shouldn't see this as an incremental way to make money. They shouldn't see this as a professional pursuit. They should see this as an entertaining alternative to going to the golf course and spending $400 on a round of golf or buying theater tickets or something along those lines. That if they have a break even Saturday or Sunday, that should be viewed as a win, because the countless hours that go into trying to give yourself that edge and eliminate that, 52.4% that you need to be successful becomes a lot more daunting. So I definitely worry about the new generation of sports bettors because I get a lot of questions asked of me. What does it take to be successful? Chris, you mentioned the model. What do I need to do to build a model? How do I get into risk management? So many questions that you just want to try and tell people, hey, look, pump the brakes, take a deep breath, figure out what works for you, and admit to yourself that you're going to lose money for a while before you can figure out a process that actually works and can be profitable.
It boils down to time and habits, and I would recommend to 99.9% of the people that ask that question, you don't have the time, and you probably don't have the proper habits either. And if you've got a wife and family, I don't know how they do it. Ron, go ahead.
Well, piggybacking on that, your talk about time management and scoping out what you're going to do from 5 a.m. and so on is exactly the approach that we've talked about in the past. Be methodical in what you do, be consistent in what you do, know exactly how you're going to react to a losing week, to a winning week, and something like that. And if we could teach people even one small thing about being true to your process, that's the way to go.
And Ron, I think you're exactly right. And one thing that I've seen circulating on the space that I actually am a big fan of is overall mental wellness, because we know the mental gymnastics that go through the ebbs and flows of the highs of a winning weekend and the lows of a losing weekend. And for those folks that haven't experienced, you have to try and find something to give yourself a floor. And as ridiculous as it sounds, I mean, meditation and yoga have been two of the biggest things for me to integrate into this as potential stress reliefs. And it sounds preposterous to think about that, but you have to find that place where you can at least quiet the noise for a little bit, come in, with a narrow focus and realize, hey, this is the life I've chosen for myself. Nobody else has picked it. And I have to understand that I can't win every single bet that I place.
It's after the first games of the day go, the second game start, take that 1 hour walk. The games are going to you're still going to watch the last hour and a half of the game. You talked about all this time management and step away. Yet at the same time, the game is changing so much that now we're talking about in-game betting. People paying attention to the pulse there and all the algorithms and beating that and so on. Is this what's your take on the value of in-game wagering? Is this something that it seems like we're getting more and more into? Is that something you're getting more and more into?
I think it's an invaluable tool, and it's a great way for people to get further engaged in the game. At the same time, I almost look at it as the quick fix and a danger territory for new bettors, because it's the one aspect of sports betting that gets even more emotional than when you're talking about betting on or against your favorite teams that are out there. So for me, my approach to live betting is probably a little bit different than most. Obviously, if you're watching a game and you feel you have a good indication of how things are going, or there's a mismatch, particularly in the trenches of a college football game, you can capitalize. But if I miss a number early in the week, knowing that these betting markets are moving earlier and earlier, that's typically when I'll jump into a game. So for example, if I'm looking for a football game and I have +4 as my buy point, but the market never gets past 3, okay, if the team that they're playing against goes down 7-0 early on, that shouldn't be a deterrent to get me off a game, because if all of us won our bets every time the first score went our way and we were able to cash those tickets 99% of the time, we'd be in a great spot. So that's kind of how I've simplified my process, specifically with football as much as anything else. I have to have my buy prices, and if I'm able to get those even for smaller limits, betting a game live, that's where I want to try and go about attacking things.
Do you think, it sounds crazy, but as I watch the trash on regular TV, is the gambling content space and discussions actually getting even better than network and they don't even realize it? What is your opinion on that?
I go back and forth, because I think there is some good gambling content that's being put out there. And, I have to be honest, I've learned an awful lot about some of the niche sports that I otherwise wouldn't follow. I don't necessarily handicap them on my own because there just aren't enough hours in the day. But I think when you look at tennis and soccer and golf, there is significantly more information and resources readily available to a new bettor than what we would have had 5 to 7 years ago. My biggest fear with the content space, and I don't know if you guys see the same thing, is to some of the more traditional stick and ball sports that people feel they have to have an NFL betting podcast, where they have to get involved in college football. And I think if you don't want to put the time in to create that content, you do a disservice to yourself by putting your name on that, and also a lot of your listenership, that there becomes a parroting that goes on based on when some of this content is released during the week, that you'll hear a lot of the same stuff on Thursdays and Fridays being hijacked from people who are putting out their content earlier in the week. So, I'm a little bit apprehensive about the direction some of that stuff is going, whereas I think a lot of the niche sports are better. And to your point, when you're talking about some of the media stuff that's out there, gambling isn't going away. I mean, I'm not telling anybody things they don't already know. And I think it's an important vehicle and a lens for people to try and view the games through. But my fear is I don't want people out there disseminating advice that aren't, quote unquote experts. And look, professional bettors aren't going to give away all their trade secrets. But I was told years ago behind the counter at Caesars, if you want the best information to bet against, it's talking to players and coaches. If they're all going one way and the betting market disagrees with them, pretty sure you're going to put yourself in a 60% proposition more often than not.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's just fascinating to listen to some of these pods and see some of these videos, and they go so much deeper and reflective than the mainstream media. It just really made me wonder that, geez, this mainstream video really doesn't have the pop it used to have, even just a few years ago compared to gambling. Go ahead, Ron.
You mentioned the NFL markets and the other markets. The NFL lines tend to be some of the tightest lines out there. And so that's why not only networking, but looking for softer areas such as season wins or props or getting in advance of the market week 1 and so on. What kinds of things, because you're already putting out these podcasts. You put out, I think, 5 NCAA podcasts for all the major conferences, and you're starting on your 8 divisional ones. Chris and I have done that as well. have you placed wagers during that time? What's your attack plan during the summer so that you're not so backed up when the season's actually going on?
So that's one of the challenges when we do some of these podcasts, because we've bet all of our win totals, a lot of yes, no's to make the playoffs. And there's not a bet that we're going to give out on the Bet the Board podcast that we haven't already bet ourselves. So that in and of itself provides a little bit of a challenge, because you don't want to try and move the betting market for certain things that may be there. I mean, we had a very prominent offshore partner when we first started our podcast. And when you look at the first half totals, whether they be NFL or college football, that weren't that liquid, as soon as some of those numbers went up, you could see that the listeners from our podcast were going there first, betting it, and then there was a little bit of a trickle-down effect. So to that point, there are definitely a lot of challenges that go into it, because the last thing I want to do, or Payne wants to do, is ever give out a bet that we haven't put our own blood, sweat, and tears, and more importantly, our bankroll behind, and lead our listeners astray. Like, I think there's a lot of information that's there. So the NFL process is a little bit different than some of the other sports, because you are trying to find ways throughout the course of the summer months. And the one thing I think is, honestly, a little bit more challenging, and I'm not sure if it's better or worse. Years ago when I first started behind the counter, we wouldn't put up NFL win totals till early August. I mean, now you have a lot of these operators that are hanging these book prices in April. And I think it's smart from a bookmaker's perspective, but from a bettor standpoint, it's awful, because they're taking lower limit bets. They're letting the markets get shaped, and they're much more comfortable taking, 4 and maybe in some cases 5-figure bets on the win totals, because they know the nickel or dime bettor who's not working with better groups or betting groups or looking to move a lot of money has already gotten down. They've paid for their R&D, and it's kind of that approach. You know what? We trust our numbers. We're going to take it from all comers. So it becomes a lot more strategic for some of the folks out there to take advantage of 120 plus college football win totals, the NFL win totals market. And I think that kind of dovetails into what we've seen as well for the NFL week, where years ago you'd see no movement on Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. And now some of the sharpest moves and the biggest moves that I know you guys talked to Matt Metcalf about last week are coming in Sunday night. They're coming in Monday morning, even before some of the Vegas books are open, because bettors go, you know what? I have to be able to get down. I want to get my position. And even if I get a partial, it's more important for me to get my number than waiting until Thursday or Friday, hoping that price might be available.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It seems like the sports books are creatively getting the bettors to do their work for them in various ways, shaping markets and such. And as you mentioned, the NFL's become a little bit frustrating, because the moves are coming earlier in the week and they're coming harder. So they didn't, they used to trickle, and you really have to make your decisions on the spot. When we talk about efficient markets, you brought it up early. The UFC, to me, is the last inefficient market, other than props or similar kind of offerings. What is your perception on that? Do you see any other markets that are, blatantly inefficient that can be exploited other than the small prop markets?
Honestly, I think it's a credit to the bookmaking acumen for a lot of the talent now getting behind the counter. As you see more and more books getting there, they're spending more on the risk management teams, whether it's computerized, managed trading solutions, which is probably a different discussion entirely, for some of the books that have millions and billions of dollars that don't want to bring in their own risk management team to try and handle it. I think those edges are getting smaller. And as a result, you're seeing some of the professional bettors that are looking to move more weight trying to bet higher volume, because they know they don't have some of those 3 to 5% edges that they grew accustomed to before. And it's what we always talk about. And I think it's fascinating with the NFL. Do you try and utilize that 1.5 to 2% on a high-end edge that you have in the NFL? Or do you spend your time trying to pick apart the WNBA, where you could see a lot bigger moves in some instances that are out there? And for a small-time bettor, look, I'm the first one to encourage you, focus on a specialized conference, look at those niche sports and be able to take advantage. But if you're looking to move a lot of money and you've been in this space for a long time, you have to be resigned to the fact that a half point here and a half point there in some of the ultra efficient markets are where you need to go for opportunity. It's funny, though, that you bring up UFC too, Chris, because that's the one sport that I honestly really don't bet at all. Occasionally, some of the guys I work with will send me a bet, but I don't really watch it. I don't really follow it. I'll watch some of the title fights. I'm more of a boxing guy, not as a handicapper, but more as a fan.
Go ahead, Ron.
I'm a one sport guy, football only. So that's fine with me. All the work in the off season is football. This is something that I've asked everybody, and that's special teams. I've said for years that evaluating special teams has been underrated. If not for special teams, the Chargers would have been in the playoffs 6 of the last 7 or 7 of the last 8 years. If not for special teams, Green Bay might be hoisting the Lombardi trophy. But these teams have ignored it for years. What's your philosophy? Is there any way that you incorporate special teams analysis into your handicapping, either in the summer or in the season?
Yeah, I mean, not only would the Chargers have won a few more games, Anthony Lynn might still be gainfully employed as a head coach out there in Southern California if that was the case.
That might be scary.
Yeah,
he went to the Lions.
I never knew it was so difficult to find a place kicker, and it's probably why my dad tells me that it's the first grandchild he has. He or she needs to end up being a place kicker because it's a straight line to try and get to the NFL and, more importantly, a college scholarship and all of it. But I do think special teams play a role. Now, do I make overarching changes to the general power rating that's there? I think you can make the adjustment of 1.5 to 2 points for some teams, but I think it's more the teams that you have to upgrade that are on the top and that top 5% and the teams that are truly in the bottom. But as we all have been there, there's no worse feeling knowing that a team's got to get inside the 25-yard line in an NFL game if they're going to have an opportunity to kick a game-winning field goal. And you're seeing some of the coaches make adjustments. I mean, Bill Belichick was one of the first guys to go, hey, look, I need specialists in this area because I understand how I can flip fields, how I can change games. Where I think it's honestly a lot more important, and it probably doesn't get incorporated into the betting market nearly as much as it should, is in college football. I mean, There is a massive disparity, even within the Power 5 conferences, for what you get from a punter, a place kicker, and a kick return game, because so much of college sports is based on emotion. And for anybody that watches, one bad play in college seems to snowball a lot faster than anything else, especially if you're betting an underdog. I mean, they could be in the game for 2.5, 3 quarters. Suddenly they fumble a punt, they set up a short field, and a 3-point deficit becomes 24. And suddenly taking 19.5 or 20 in a game that you thought was going to be a rocking chair becomes a brutal front door cover against you in the final minutes.
Perfect analysis there. What boggles the mind is in the Big Ten, you're talking about $100 million contracts coming in. Nebraska for 4 straight years never even had a special team coordinator. And that was, they are having one this year. But for 4 years, and if you look back at their season, 7 games were decided by a handful of points, and a lot of them included botched snaps, field goals, punt returns for touchdowns, and so on. I like that point in terms of that one play, and because there's higher scoring in college in general, I would argue as well that one turnover is worth a lot of points. It's not worth the old 2 or 3 points. It's worth 4 points.
And I mean, you mentioned Nebraska. I mean, no greater illustration of their game they played in East Lansing last year against Michigan State. I think Michigan State finished the second half with 1 first down in that contest. They had a punt return touchdown. And for somebody who got in early and took +5.5 and +6, there was no worse feeling knowing that you dominated that football game from start to finish, and you had to hold on for dear life with a goal line stand to cash that full position. But it just speaks to coaches and where they want to place their emphasis. But there is no doubt if you're a college coach and you want to get your team not just bowl eligible, but in the upper echelon, especially in those Power 5 conferences, that you have to invest in. You have to have those uncomfortable discussions with some of your 4- and 5-star recruits that, look, these special teams plays are going to go a long way. They're going to help us win football games. And maybe more importantly, it could find you a job at the next level, especially as a rookie or sophomore.
Your time at Fox required you were on a show that was basically pick focused. I think I heard you refer to it as sort of like a game show on another pod. What is the mental process going through your head when things just aren't going your way and you're on national TV? And, what's the difference between when things are going poorly and when they're going well?
Everything feels like it's exaggerated. You feel like a 2-day losing streak has been going on for 2 months, and you're asking yourself if you're ever going to be able to win again. And with the components of, Lock It In, then Fox Bet Live, you weren't just competing against the book. I mean, you're competing against 2 other people that, as much as I love Cousin Sal and Clay, have different, more unorthodox betting styles. So trying to predict some of their moves and how you had to adapt game theory for that definitely wouldn't have been the same as if the 3 of us were trying to match wits. So you're figuring out how to structure your bankroll. You're displaying what I wouldn't define as best practices because you're betting a lot bigger on Friday's show, trying to set yourself up for the weekend and try and maneuver based on what other people have done. So I look at that show. It was as much a gimmick as anything else. We prided ourselves on trying to entertain folks for the hour that we were on for season 1 and the half hour for the subsequent seasons thereafter. But there's no doubt it wasn't a level of sophistication and overall sharp betting discussion by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think a lot of people, came at me. They were critical. They go, well, you're teaching people the wrong things. And I would always remind them that they have to look at the lens and the vehicle for which we're doing this. So yes, a bet that you make on Monday that may be 10 show dollars isn't necessarily much less of an edge than you're betting 300 show dollars on Friday. We're trying to put together, a 3-team parlay to try and win the week, knowing that was the grandiose vision. The same way that when you look at some of these betting contests that go on in regulated jurisdictions, you have to adopt a very different process on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday because you're playing against the other competitors more so than playing against the house. And I think what's different about that, when you can structure your bankroll accordingly, it's even a little bit different than a lot of the football contests that I know we all compete in as well.
Speaking of contests,
I listened to one of your podcasts, and you were talking about, this was last year's podcast, so they hadn't done the Thanksgiving Day standalone week and the Christmas Day standalone week, and then that whole Tampa Bay, Kansas City thing. And even though I don't do those kinds of contests, at least not for big money, I was fascinated by what Circa was trying to do. Now that that's been done for 1 year, and I don't know whether you participated or not, how do you feel about all that? It just seems like it's kind of forced the issue. It becomes a more, from the outside looking in, it seems more luck than skill.
Well, one thing, let me tell you, I wish that when we had won the Survivor contest, it wasn't in Circa's inaugural season and split it with 300 and some odd other people or whatever it may have been for, what was a nice payout, but not quite as healthy as it should have been. I much would have preferred to win last year and take home north of 7 figures along with Payne, but not going to cry over spilled milk by any stretch. I think when you look at those contests, there's no doubt, Ron, that there is a huge luck component that plays a role, especially when you're talking about those nuances that Derek has loved to incorporate to try and pare down the field a little bit. But I also think it's the kind of contest that there is a huge component of skill because you have to look at, what amounts to a 20-week season when you incorporate Christmas and Thanksgiving and kind of be willing to lose that pool early on if you want to have an opportunity to win it late. Yeah. And a lot of people in Survivor go, well, what the hell are you talking about? Like, what does that even mean? The goal should be to advance week to week. What good does it do me if I get to week 14, I've painted myself into a corner and I have no useful bullets left? But I think most people look at it in a pool like that, that's $1,000 entry, which is no small change to most. They go, you know what? I'm going to look at week 14 and that's going to be future Todd's problem. I just want to try and advance and I'll sort out the aftermath later. So the same philosophy that was successful for us in season 1 and allowed us to win it had us knocked out in week 2. But for me, I'm in it to win it. I don't care how deep I get in it. And what the hell is the difference if I go out week 3 or if I go out week 16? And of course, that changes based on the size of the pool, the level of competition, and how sophisticated some of the folks are. You're in a friendly office pool with 15 or 20 coworkers. By all means, figure it out week to week. Most likely people are going to beat themselves up. Just, my one bit of advice, don't take the biggest favor on the board, root against it, and you may see 90% of the field potentially eliminated in any given week. Yeah. Whereas a contest like Circa, a much higher level of thinking and sophistication if you're going to give yourself an opportunity to go through, 19 or 20 NFL teams and hope you can run the gauntlet that way.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. It's actually one of the few things that I basically held back for the most part with a lot of the shows that I've done is it makes no difference whether you're out early or late. You're going to have to take risks along the way. Why not do it earlier than later? It's my thought process. What I wanted to ask is, obviously, none of us can originate anything, and I found myself relying on other people. What percentage of your wagers have become developed from trust in others versus what you're originating on your own?
Oh, I think you have to have a ton of trust in others. And I would say, honestly, at this point, trying to diversify the portfolio, what I'm originating is a very small percentage of my individual betting portfolio. The interesting part is we all know you work with other guys. You're trying to figure out how you can get them down in certain sports, how they can help you as well. So it really creates that true symbiotic relationship that's there, that you have to be resigned to the fact that, I might not be the initial move, but I have an idea of when these things are going to go. So if I'm taking a half point worse the number, so be it. I would say if I'm looking at a sport in general, NASCAR is the one sport that we're doing a lot of the originating more so than anything else. I'm not going to claim that I have a proprietary model in football or that I'm betting, 95% of my stuff into, circus college football openers, like I know you guys talked about with Brad Powers on a previous episode, that I have to understand, hey, look, it's going to take me a little while to get through my process. I have to feel comfortable. And if I do happen to miss a bet, so be it. There's going to be another opportunity to try and bet something coming up. And it all changes based on market in terms of when you're entering versus the life cycle of a football line, as you guys know all too well, versus, some of the daily grind that we all get ourselves into, whether it's baseball, hockey, or what have you.
Yeah, I think
mentioned Brad.
Aspect is just absolutely invaluable. Go ahead, Ron. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Okay, I'm going to save this question for a second. But you mentioned Brad, and I thought that was one of the fascinating things. One of the questions I asked him was, of his 200 and some future wagers, how many of them were just picking off outliers, things that you knew that you had value, but you didn't even know if you liked that team yet. And he did say it was a large amount, and it's a theory that I subscribe to as well. I'm just picking off some stuff and I'll come back to it later, figuring that I have the best of the line at that point.
And I mean, I think we see a lot of that, Ron, now in the NFL. And Chris, I'd be curious to get your take on this. I mean, we all go through a process where we cultivate our lean list and try and identify, hey, look, here's where I think some of my edges are going to come. But you see a game potentially moving late Sunday or early Monday, it almost benefits you to go, you know what, the hell with it. I'm going to bet it. And I'm going to figure out what to do with it later if I know that's the way the market's going. Worst case scenario, I can go under 44, and I may have a chance to come back over 43 on a total. Long term, is it plus EV? Probably not. But at the same time, I don't want to run the risk of taking a bad number in a particular equation if it's a game that I think I'm going to fall in love with by the time kickoff rolls around on Sunday.
I mean, if you can catch the slow-moving books and you know you already had that value sitting there slapping you in the face, that line's probably moving for a reason. So I lean toward going ahead and taking it versus letting it go by in certain cases. But I'm not going to do it in small markets or things that are really steaming, because account preservation is my number one goal with all this betting. That's why I steer away from props. I steer away from draft type stuff, preseason football. The books don't want that crap. It just makes you stand out and it gets you limited. And I just can't afford to have that happen.
It's one of the most underrated components. And I know this doesn't always speak to a lot of folks out there, but I remember, some of the dialogue I had with sharper bettors when I was behind the counter at Caesars. And at that point in my life, I was probably betting 55 to win 50. I was walking to the Barbary Coast on my lunch break from the Paris if I wanted to bet, college basketball games that given night. And the more I got into it, they were honest. They go, we respect a lot of the counter limits that you guys impose on us because it's more important for us to be in business. If we decide we're going to take a shot and we can't bet here anymore, then it really limits some of the upside. And they go, for any bettor that's worth his or her salt, the longer you're in this space, the challenge doesn't always come in just finding winners, which we know can be extremely daunting, but it's being able to move enough where you have that edge and be able to maximize an opportunity when it presents itself.
This